Good evening, everyone. I'm extremely delighted to welcome all of you to this panel, which is entitled as Early Modern Registers, Dialogues in Dutch and Malabar Sources, being co-organized by iShore and the Aazhi Archive, the sea, a boiling vessel. I am from iShore. iShore stands for Institute for Social Sciences, Humanities and Oceanic Research. It is basically a network of scholars from Kerala working all over the country and beyond the country with a shared interest in the Kerala's broader history and culture in the Indian Ocean world. As it sounds to be, it is a transdisciplinary enterprise, and all of us actually comes from different disciplinary backgrounds. At the same time, concerned about the limits of these disciplinary boundaries. iShore took its birth during the pandemic times and now is registered as a society and is gradually expanding its activities and seeks to provide a platform for national and international scholars and researchers who are interested in the socio-cultural and economic traditions and conditions of the region. And through the programs of today and yesterday, we started with a book discussion yesterday, and we had this workshop for young researchers on Dutch archives today, and the one we are currently in. Through these programs, iShore begins its activities for the year, and a series of talks as well as workshops are lined up for the rest of the year, apart from initiating a few research projects. We are extremely happy that we are collaborating with the Aazhi Archives, with whom, of course, we share this interest in the oceanic histories of the region. And of course, its terrestrial histories, which is determined by its oceanic connections. And we are thankful to the entire Aazhi team, particularly to Mr. Riaz Komu, Professor C.S. Venkateswaran, and Professor M.H. Ilyas for this much valued association. The panel today basically aims to initiate a dialogue between specialists in Dutch, Malayalam, Syriac and Arabic sources produced in and on the region of Malabar during the so-called Dutch period, say between the late 17th century and 18th century, the so-called early modern period. And also, as all of us know, much has been written about the Portuguese and Dutch periods on Malabar. Yet, enormous registry of sources remained either unexplored or underexplored in the archives of Asia as well as Europe. And we know that during the last 2 decades or so, historians from Leiden University have unearthed a mine of Dutch sources, shedding light on the social, political and economic trajectories of the early modern Malabar. But very few historians have read and analyzed these Portuguese and Dutch sources in juxtaposition with the sources which are produced within the region and particularly in the local languages. And this assumes greater importance, particularly because of the reason that the period between 16th and 18th century witnessed an extensive production of written materials in the region in diverse languages, Malayalam, be it Malayalam, Tamil, Sanskrit, Arabic, Hebrew, Syriac, and Persian, along with many hybrid dialects like Garshuni Malayalam and Arabi Malayalam. And our speakers today are specialists in different historical sources. And of course, some of them have used both sources, Dutch as well as the local sources. and they will speak from their respective archival locations. Of course, with a larger agenda of how profitably a combined reading of these sources can give us new possibilities of using the archive, and perhaps through which enabling new visions and new understanding of history to some of the pressing problems, say for instance on diverse questions like if the period stands out from the periods of European expansion and from the periods in other parts of the country and from the periods in the Indian Ocean world. And perhaps also how the region would be situated in the 18th century debate, by reading these sources together. Also perhaps, as Professor Jose was indicating in the morning, if some of the historical tendencies and movements which were associated or seen associated largely with the 19th and 20th century in the region has a longer historical making. He was actually speaking about the Kerala Renaissance in the morning. So all these parallel and transecting use of diverse sources needs to, I think, go beyond the prosaic of using other sources as context, which usually we do, even when we actually use one particular source as a prime source. Other sources are actually brought in as context to understand that prime source. So how can we actually go beyond this idea of using multiple sources as context to the prime source and use them as cortex in their mutuality? I hope this exercise will restate the necessity of going beyond reading the archive forms in isolation towards reading them in a kind of larger archival continuum, for having a much more integrated and inclusive picture of early modern Kerala. And genealogy is configured by its oceanic connections. With those words, I invite Professor C.S. Venkateshwaran from the Aazhi Archives to make a remark.
Thank you. I think we are really honored and excited to associate with iShore for this program, two-day program, looking at new archival material on Kerala's maritime history and the different possibilities that it opens up, not only in terms of historical research, but also we think from the point of view of Aazhi Archives, also opens up a lot of possibilities for artistic work, to artists from different medium to work with the kind of archival material that is being opened up, to look at, imagine, memorize, recreate, or analyze the past in different ways. That is one of the things that this CA Boiling Vessel project is trying to do. So a few words about Aazhi Archives. Aazhi Archives is basically a very informal but very closely knit collective of artists, writers, scholars who are engaged in education, art, art making, publication, journalism, research, and all that. Basically, we have been thinking about this project for quite a long time, because there was this COVID, intervening COVID years actually had a kind of, we had to postpone our programs to 2022-23. What we were looking at is the basic objective of Aazhi Archives is to explore Kerala's maritime history from various points of view, and also to try to engage with the very exciting academic work that is happening all around the world about Indian Ocean studies, and connecting it with art making, art practices, and imagining our history in a totally different manner. If you look at art history of India, or even of Kerala, you can say that it is largely a terrestrial in character. So we want to create a kind of shift from the terrestrial to a kind of maritime imagination. That is one of the objectives of this CA Boiling Vessel project, which I hope most of you must have seen. So one thing about the functioning of Aazhi Archives, it is informal. It is actually a collective of academics as well as artists. And it is also a kind of, in a way, it is also engages with the idea that Cochin University's Biennale started with, of trying to imagine Kochi as a cosmopolitan, place which engaged with the world through the ocean and has a long, very rich, complex history. So basic idea is to actually engage with academic work in maritime history and imagination, and also trying to bring artists in conversation with these academic or knowledge being produced in these new areas of research. So we have had, if you look at our this CA boiling vessel project, you can see a lot of different kinds of medium at work. We have photography, we have philately, we have conventional paintings, sculptures, graphic work. A lot of we want to actually look at maritime history from different perspectives and through different media. That is the whole idea of this project. And through the last 1 month of our experience of people coming and watching the show, a lot of curators came, artists, programmers, academics, scholars, students. A lot of them came, watched the show, and we had very interesting conversations with them, which actually opened up a lot of possibilities in which this project can be taken forward in different lines, along different media, and also along different academic areas where we can actually engage with academics, engaging with or conversing with artists. So we have had, even in this project, we have an association with a lot of academic institutions like MG University, Kerala Council for Historical Research, iShore, for instance, the NIROX Foundation, Witwatersrand University, Johannesburg. So a lot of them came together to actually give us a lot of inputs and also support our project by giving a lot of different kinds of inputs, especially knowledge inputs. And we have had we have been associating with a lot of individual scholars, and also many of these works you see at CA Boiling Vessel are offshoots or artist response to certain academic and artistic work. For instance, we have taken Sanal Mohan's Modernity of Slavery as one book to which artists respond. Another book is Peter Van Duzen's Testimonies of Enslavement. Then we have Tony Joseph's Early Indians. And lastly, Sandeep Unnikishan's Temporary People. All these are some of the literary works, literary and academic research that the artists engage with, which we thought was one way in which you can actually trigger or create conversations between creation of knowledge, academic knowledge, with artists and art creation. So we conceive of these Aazhi Archives as a kind of hub of learning where academics and artists can come together and also explore different kinds of possibilities that these projects and lines of argument or imagination is opening up. So I think we have, through this project, we have been able to connect with a lot of institutions and academics who have taken interest in taking this show elsewhere and also extending some aspects of this project into different kinds of domains, which is what we are actually excited about. And this workshop with iShow of the last 2 days, this students' workshop today, looking at Dutch archives and the new set of students looking at ways in which they can continue their academic pursuit by engaging with a new different kinds of archives that are being opened up. Is also, I think, connects very much with what CA Boiling Vessel and Aazhi Archives is doing, and we look forward to a long-term association with iShore. And all the students who came here, I thank them for coming and hope to engage and converse and partner with them in our future projects. And also all the resource persons who came, Korea, Abhilash, all those scholars who participated in the event and gave their inputs. We look forward to a long-term partnership. And we, from Aazhi Archives, our team of Aazhi Archives, we thank you very much for coming here and spending time with us for this project. Thank you.
iShore is a new initiative, and we are putting together things scratch by scratch. And we have now put together a website, and now we want to just launch that website. I request Professor Gomez and Professor Susan Thomas to launch it together, just by clicking, on, yes. Okay, so the format of the panel would be something like this. Each, panelist will speak for 15 minutes in the beginning. And at the end of this, there will be a space for conversation between them. And then it will be, opened up for discussion. Of course, I know that all the panelists are specialists in specific forms of archive. And of course, the primacy of that archives can be foregrounded. But at the same time, if your discussion can focus a little more on the advantages of reading different archives together, that would be much more interesting to a wider set of scholars. So that basically means that perhaps you will have to identify the limits of some of your archive forms, which another form can potentially resolve, right? With those words, I request my colleague, Dr. Fatima, to introduce the speakers.
Good evening. This is definitely a proud moment for us because we've been looking forward to this moment for the past 2 years. And thanks to all of you, all our resource persons, all the students who attended the workshop in the morning. We've been, we've come to the first stage when the physical realization of our ambitions have started. So I thank all of you at the beginning itself. So some of the speakers, 3 of them, obviously, as you know, 3 of them spoke in the morning, and we're welcoming them back again. So I'd begin with Professor Jos Hermans, who is in charge of Cosmos Malabaricus project. And you all know him already because of his scintillating performance, along with his camel shirt as well, today morning. Welcome back, Professor. Professor Gomez is a professor of colonial and global history at Leiden University. He publishes primarily on medieval and early modern South and Central Asian history, Dutch colonial history, and global intellectual history. He has to his credit several articles, 2 historical atlases, 7 edited volumes, and 4 monographs. He inventoried or otherwise improved the accessibility of VOC documents in India, London, and Netherlands. He has also co-authored 3 archival guides in the series which he talked about in the morning. In the series, Dutch Sources on South Asia, 1600 to 1825, which describes series which describe early modern Dutch source materials worldwide on India and Ceylon, which he did talk about in the morning. Then we have the second speaker of the morning, Dr. Leonard Bess, who gave us a presentation on the overwhelming but very intimidating but also very exciting archival registry of VOC and other Dutch colonial sources. He is an Indologist who was heavily involved and who was and is heavily involved in archiving. While he was I feel like an upstart because I'm not from history and I'm learning history as we go. So archiving while he was at the National Archives in The Hague. And he has moved to Leiden and is currently teaching history at Leiden. He is published on the 18th century Ramnad and its perceptions of the Dutch. His work on successor states of Vijayanagara was talked about yesterday as part of our book series discussion program. Professor Susan Thomas. professor of history, is a professor of history at Sanskrit University. Her PhD was in property relations and family forms of colonial Kerala, and her postdoctoral research was on historicizing church and community, Syrian Christian community in the 19th and 20th century Kerala. Through the digitized, and she's been looking at it through the digitized palm leaf records as part of an international project. And she is, as I talked to Varghese, I understand that she is recently involved in collecting documents available in Syriac and Gershoni as part of an international project for digitization of records of Syrian Christian community in collaboration with Central European University Budapest, Hill Museum and Manuscript Library Minnesota, and Tübingen University. Caroline Stolte, senior lecturer at Leiden University, has done her research focused on the international history of South Asia from a transnational perspective. Caroline is currently working on Afro-Asian networks in the early Cold War and is a director of education at Leiden Institute of History, the Netherlands. Her research focuses on international history of South Asia, and her current project is entitled Southern Crossings, Indian Activists and Afro-Asian Moment in the Afro-Asian Moment in the Early Cold War. And it is funded by NWO Veni Grant. Stolte is an editor-in-chief of the journal Itinerario, brought out by Cambridge University Press, as well as the editor. She's also the editor of the book series Global Connections, Roots and Roots, and she has coordinated from 2012 to 2014. She has coordinated the Cosmopolis project. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University and served as a member of the Executive Council of the World History Association. In 2020, she was awarded an early career award by the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Dineshan Vadakkinian was not able to come today because of some emergency domestic situation. Should I read about him? Professor Dineshan Vadakkinian, professor of social science School of Social Sciences, Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam, has taught history in various colleges in Kerala, government colleges in Kerala, and has worked as an academic coordinator of KCHR. And he was an ICSSR scholar who obtained his PhD from the University of Bergen, Norway, and his postdoctoral research at the Department of Social Anthropology was done at the University of Bergen again. He contributes regular scholarly articles regularly in English and Malayalam, and he has 3 books to his credit. Dr. Binu John Mailaparambil, who was also a speaker in the morning, works at Christ College, Irinjalakuda. He has obtained his doctorate in history at the University of Leiden and his postdoctoral degree from the Department of History, Bielefeld University, Germany. He's the author of the much appreciated Lords of the Sea, the Ali Rajas of Kannur, and the Political Economy of Malabar, which is a monograph based on Dutch archives and which sheds new light on the state society of Malabar. Suja, I have introduced Susan. Yes, of course. Yes, and I also would like to mention our RE representative. I have a personal thing in it because he's also a translator like me. So C.S. Venkateswaran, I'd like to give a brief bio note on him. C.S. Venkateswaran is a film critic. He's a wearer of many hats. So he's a film critic, professor, multiple award-winning documentary filmmaker, artistic director and curator. He's a writer and also a translator, an occasional, and as he describes himself, an occasional subtitler hailing from Chalakudy, Kerala, and who writes predominantly in English and Malayalam. Thank you. Welcome. Who would you like to? Professor Gormans? I would like to welcome Professor Gormans on stage. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. So thank you, Fatima, for these kind words about my CV and my shirt. So I'm glad you like it. I have just 15 minutes, and this morning in the workshop we were talking already for a couple of hours about the wonderful things you can do with the Dutch archive. And so what I want to do right now, having just 15 minutes, also as a kind of opening up the discussion, is a kind of proposal to you. So the proposal I have is coming from thinking about what for the next 7 years the program that I'm leading, so Cosmos Malabaricus, could do in terms of its research agenda. From my own point of view, and also from Leonard's best point of view, and I think it is really important that we look at possibilities of intersections. So what do I mean with these intersections? I mean with these intersections where, let's say, the Dutch sources meet the vernacular local sources. Also, in the workshop in the morning, I think Binu John, who also will speak later, was a bit skeptical of, let's say, this ambition. So it's quite a challenge. And it's also clear that in terms of volume, I'm not entirely sure whether the Dutch sources are the best. So if I just read about what is available or what should be available in terms of sources on early modern Kerala, early modern Malabar, I think there's much more material. For example, in Syriac. For example, in Granta, in Malayalam. I'm referring to these Grandavari traditions that you have about local Swarupams, but also in particular about temples. So for me the challenge was, and I would like to share it with you because we can still change the agenda. The challenge was to find topics where perhaps it's most likely that the materials will overlap, where you find such intersection. So this is a graph which I used this morning because I think the program should focus on three, let's say, institutes or three phenomena that are very described in detail by the Dutch sources that we are dealing with. We are dealing with 100 meters of materials, which goes in detail about three elements: the court, the temple. It's not only the temple, but also the synagogue, the church, and the mosque. And also about the market. So I traveled a lot during the first week, in particular in Kottayam, and there was a pattern that I think we detected, which is not so surprising. You know, there's a hill, on the hill there is the court, next door there is the favorite temple of the king, then you go out and you see a synagogue, well, in this case not a synagogue, but at least a church, a temple, and a mosque. And they were often very near to the river, where you get access through the backwaters to the ocean. So there's a kind of pattern that we would like to study, perhaps even adopting one particular locality, so that in these 7 years that we have available, we can reach some depth, and also find some intersectional situation where other sources can actually come into the picture. So can I have the next slide? So this is at the moment my proposal for Cosmos Malabaricus. So based on the intersection of different sources, Cosmos Malabaricus aims at an integrated analysis of the political history of early modern Kerala in its tripartite dynamic between courts, temples, and all these other religious institutions and markets. So as an example, I think, so at the moment, if you think about what has been going on for, let's say, the last decades, most historians that worked with Dutch materials focused on markets, on commodities, on commerce, because the Dutch East India Company was a trader. But of course in Kerala it was not just a trader, it was also a colonial force. It was administering the region very in minutest detail, so to say. It tried to manipulate the courts, and it also tried to manipulate the market. And here's my point. Looking at the specific, let's say, capacity of the Kerala material, I think it would be a good idea to really focus on the temple. Because if we focus on the temple, I think also it is quite likely that we can actually bring in other materials as long as these temple authorities also want to collaborate, because that is also, of course, the great challenge, I think, for the future. So could I have the next slide? I would like to say a few words about what will happen if we focus on the temple. And I think focusing on the temple, using Dutch materials would not be very successful if I would work on Bengal, or if I would work on Gujarat, or even on Tamil Nadu. I know, having discussions with Leonard for years, it was quite rare to come across a reference to a temple in detail. So, let's try what happens to Kerala if we focus on the temple. First of all, I think we have this marvelous description by one of my former heroes, and of course nowadays I should be careful, Hendrik Adriaan van Rede tot Drakenstein, so Van Reed, as you call him, Van Reed, who also thought about Kerala society and stayed here quite a while and really realized that if you really want to understand that society, you should understand its customs and understand its history. Of course, we have seen this before in the colonial past, so be on your guard. We cannot trust him entirely because Van Rede also had another agenda, that is, how can we control Kerala and how can we perhaps impose a pepper monopoly on that society. Oh, sorry, the previous one. Yeah, so this is coming from these are his words, and we don't have to read it right now, but what is really interesting is that he refers to the temple as something that he does not recognize, because we don't have temples in the Netherlands. So you have to know that he tried to understand Kerala by using a Dutch model. So he was talking about barons. He was talking about the rights and privileges of the nobility in a way that one would describe 17th century Holland. But there was this one institution, the temple, that he struggled with. So he made the point that the temple is actually something that should be compared to free cities, so free towns with its own privileges, a kind of enclave of liberties, which often are situated in the most well-cultivated, let's say, lands. So I think there is already an indication that a temple is much more than a place for religious devotion. It is also a political institution, a political place, but also an economic place. Could I go to the next slide? I would like to focus on one example, that is the Tiruvalla temple, which I also referred to this morning. But try to go a little bit more in depth about that temple in the last 5 minutes, 10 or 5 minutes. But there are also other possibilities. For example, there are quite a lot of 17th, 18th century conflicts around the Padmanabhaswamy temple in Trivandrum. And I already checked to what extent the literature that is there coming from indigenous, so let's say Kerala material, can be connected to Dutch materials. And I think this is really very promising. What are the possibilities there? But let's go to Tiruvalla. So, of course, and you will notice, temples were also places where people competed for power. So to get a kind of, I use the term custody, patronage would be another term. So temples were, let's say, the various swarupams in Kerala really competed with each other to control the temple. And one of these temples is the Tiruvalla temple, which is more or less at the boundary of, let's say, Venat, later Travancore, and also Cochin. Could we go to the next slide? So this is the temple coming from Wikipedia, also a very good source that we should use. Next one. So here it's coming from a register. I was just looking, because I'm not, as you know, I have a camel shirt, I'm not really a guy from the tropical seas, but more of the steppes. So I had to do a lot of homework also for preparing coming to Kerala. But for example, this is something you can find in the index. So it tells you how, let's say in this case, the Paliachan, who is actually seen as the first minister of Cochin, the queen and the third prince, they also are, let's say, trying to meddle in the situation at the temple of Tiruvalla and thinking about chasing away the Brahmins over there. So this is in 1724. So this is already something that you will not easily find in other regions of India. And my expectation is that you will find much more of this, because all these temples were one way or the other were linked to the court. Or you can also say the court were linked to the temple, because you can also think about a model where the temple is really central and not the state, or not, let's say, the Swarupam or the court. The next one, please. So this one I used this morning also to show the students how complicated it can be to use Dutch sources. But this is quite a revealing, let's say, citation from 1701, which is actually telling us that Tiruvalla is considered the jewel in the Cochin crown. I think this is not something that is generally known. What is also interesting, if you look at this and have a look at this citation, is also that it's clearly connected to the position of the company. So the company is realizing, whether it's in truth or not, it's realizing that the Cochin crown can only maintain itself over there with the support of the Dutch East India Company. And what is also really funny, this morning there was somebody coming from the south, from that region. Of course I was hoping nobody was coming from there, because if you look at the last sentence, it's a bit problematic perhaps. So for the natural inhabitants of Tiruvalla are hot-headed, bullish and recalcitrant guys, and more mischievous than the other Malabaris. And there was one guy and actually said, you know, I actually agree. It's actually not that much, not far away from how I see it. Okay. So then I visited, 2 days ago, I visited the temple, really curious about it. And then Leonard and I were actually talking to somebody who was not a Brahmin. He said he was a Nayar. And he gave me this book, which is in Malayalam, so I couldn't read it, but there's a nice summary at the end. And to my big surprise, and also Leonard's surprise, and of course, you know, this is not scientific, we just had a talk. But to our surprise, we found out that the icon that you find there is actually quite recent. And it has been taken from Vijayanagara in the, after, let's say, the battle which meant the end of Vijayanagara. And so the idol was rescued from invaders, as is saying in this book, as it was believed to be given to Sagrajit by Lord Krishna himself before Samadhi. The deity mentioned, according to Nama Aswar, is by the name Kolapiram. The old deity was shifted. Okay, so all this information suggests that there is even a connection of this temple with a world that Leonard Best knows very well from his book, and that goes beyond the gods. So let me have the last slide. So focusing on the temple means that you can map certain rivalries that are going on between various Swarupams, but there's also a very interesting connection, even, let's say, even more distant in this case. And, of course, the challenge will be to see whether we can get access to other materials on this topic. But almost each and every temple from the 14th, 15th century has a very rich Kandavri tradition. So my question to you is, and also to Binu, having listened to your presentation in the afternoon, can we really make that bridge? Can we really combine Kandavri materials with Dutch materials? Because they, in this case, you know, by making a choice to focus on the temples, you would be able to combine these materials. Also because the Kandavri tradition is also full of records about land management. So I think, yeah, so this is something I still struggle with. And for now, it's a proposal. It's a proposal whether or not this is a good idea. And of course, this is only about the temple. And let's see. So let me know what you think. Thank you.
I was almost scrapping my presentation and I had something else coming up into my mind. But after Gom's presentation, I'm sticking to it because I think I will have to sort of tell him that it's not just the temples that we do have other materials too. Let me go back to 1994. When I came for my PhD, I wanted to do on the Syrian Christian community. And my guide told me that you have no sources. The best you can do is study about the property relations, because then the famous Mary Roy case judgment had gone on. I had to wait probably till 2005 when I met up with Professor Istvan Perzel and his project, when he had come down to digitize Syriac manuscripts. But going with him to churches, I realized it was not just the churches that had repositories. We had monasteries. We had big tarawads. I wouldn't call it tarawads, but yeah, the Syrian Christian houses, which had leaves, the older houses, and other places where there are a lot more of these material. And these materials, I specialized in palm leaves, but these materials are not just in palm leaves. They are not just in Malayalam. They are in Syriac, they are in Garshuni, that is Syriac in Malayalam. And many of these manuscripts also have Malayalam material on it. So we went on and we digitized around 7 or 8 terabytes of material, and most of which are yet to be unraveled. I'll just give you 2 examples. Just yesterday, I was talking to Emmy Merrin, who works with Istvan, and in the HMML Malayalam folio, she got a translation from the Tiruvanjikulam temple inscription. It says it's a translation of the Tiruvanjikulam temple inscription, but we're not able to identify which is the king. It talks about the gills, it talks about things. And so we said, let's get on with it, we'll talk about it, and we'll see what it is. And she has sent me the folios today, so we'll have to look at it to understand. Secondly, let me bring your attention to the Garshuni version of the famous Syrian Christian copper plate, which has been talked a lot about by Istvan. So if you look at Kerala history, we've had Midland, Brahmin-centered history. We've been looking inside. We've not looked at the coast. The coast is underrepresented. We need to look out, because Kerala, I believe, was always a place where we looked out. It was this connectivity to the ocean that made us what we are and who we are. But we talk about the Christians, the Muslims, the Jains, all the heterodox religions, especially if you study, look at the syllabi, they just, placed or lumped together at some point without reference to chronology or space. And we just talk about them as if they don't change, they're static. And then we talk about MGS's famous cultural symbiosis. Yeah, we love it because it tells us how tolerant we are and explains our harmonious existence. We would like to be different, Kerala model, yeah. But then, Grandhavaris, yeah. Madilamgandam Grandhavaris, we know about them. People have looked into it. In the 90s, early 90s, we have had the Vanyeri Grandhavari, the Kudali Grandhavari, which has, in fact, looked into these midland terrains. So, what is it? We always look at history from the larger trajectories. The trajectories of the political, we follow the nation, we follow the major communities or the community that has a major say, let me put it that way. Economic, yeah. When we talk about the ocean, we talk about the routes, we talk about the goods, the volume of trade. And then, if you come to the colonial period, we will lament. And the colonials become the enemy. And that's it. So, regional histories, oceanic histories have become important. From Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean that we are talking about, into the Cosmos Malabaricus project. But these archives, and I will specifically talk about the palm leaf archives because that is where I have worked into. They look at micro-histories. They look at religious histories. They look at theology from a very different point of view. They show the everyday life of the people. They show how church is trying to discipline. Now, when I talk of the church and the people, it's not just the community that I'm talking about or the parish that I'm talking about. I'm talking about all the people who come in contact with the church. Because church, too, like the temples, were going on and becoming tenants. They were taking land. We have instances of palm leaves from the Korati church where the king of Cochin was leasing his land to the church, and then the church subleases it to the tenants. You have in Kurpambadi a reference of a black Jew who sells him damask silk cloth. And that amount is a sizable amount. And our understanding, our traditional understanding about our black Jews is that, you know, they were subordinate economically. But if you look at that, you will sit and wonder. This is a person who has supplied the church with a material that is very costly. So you will have to relook at things. Again, if you look at we call it the Sastikon, or the letter that is given by the patriarch when a bishop comes in from the Middle East. The Sastikon of Mar Aldo Morboselius will give you a list of all the people who have come before, and then you will find that the bishop at Kallada is not mentioned. So you have your larger histories here. You have your smaller histories there. I mean, have I gone on? Do I have time to actually show you some of these things? I do not know. Can you just run through it? Yeah. This is how an account bundle will look like. And unfortunately, many of them will be scattered around. Some of them will be in covers. And can I go on to the next slide? Yeah. This is one Ola that I have looked at from the Kurpambadi church that is in the Koleruthu that belongs to the 18th century. Yeah, that's it, please don't move. This is the Koleruthu Ola that is dated 1770. We always think about factional fights between the Catholics and the Jacobite or the Orthodox Church now as something that happened immediately. But this chronicle will tell you that it was not something that happened immediately after the Oath of Coon and Cross. You had to go 150 years later. And then if you go to the Nadamai church, that is another chronicle which is around 1823, you can see community formations. Can I? Yeah. And then I would like to talk about this. This is one of my favorite. We always talk about, what do you say, adulterous relationships and smartha vijaram among Brahmin community. But in the 1860s, I found that in the churches, not just in one, but many churches, I found these, where you have the church interrogating these people. And the documents that I get here are documents that are, appeals to the yogam, which says, I have sinned. Now I have accepted all the punishments that you have given me. Now please take me back. I've just taken one out of the two because it belongs to the man and the woman. Can you go further? Again, what was interesting for me in Ailey's document, Ailey is the woman who was involved. Many of them are widows. And then you'll understand why they had to look out for somebody else for that protection. You would find, first of all, that there was a correction that was happening. She had written, or rather she was not somebody who knew how to write. She got it written by somebody else. You can see the difference in the Ola. Varki's Ola was written in the official way, 10 lines perfectly written and couched, while Ailey's Ola was not so well written, while you had mistakes. She will say, yeah, I'm sorry, Kramaked happened. Kramaked is that something what should not have happened has happened. And yes, Pettu dosham. We call it in a totally in a Malayalam lingo, it's like the local usage when you get pregnant without being legally involved in a relationship. You can say adikala dosham, petu dosham, and all that. And that petu dosham was stricken off, and then you have vyabhijara dosham. Vyabhijaram then becomes adultery. So a loaded, ethically loaded term is being used. And again, here you would find, what are the punishment? You have to go stand as an individual in front of the church holding a cross. Everyone in the church knew she was being punished. Is this the emergence of the individual, where otherwise the family would be, if you look at Smartha Vijaram among the Nambudris, it's a very different thing. You don't have absolution and being taken back into the fold. They're being taken back. Can I have the next one? Yeah, this is the Ola that was written by Varki I. This one was the Ola. This is another Ola, which was written by another lady that was involved. She had access to certain amount of economic access. So her Ola was very different. And if you see what happens is that, what you see is that many of these things have, who are the scribes? That becomes an important question. Because the church accounts initially was written by the trustees, and then in Kurpumbadi I get the instance of an accountant being kept, and then later on, if you look at the olas that we have from the Devasam or from the landlord houses, you would find that the Sthana Kanaka had written these olas, as you would see. And then you would find that if they are tax receipts, they were written by the local Pravarti, and you have who was the official and who was the one who had written it. Yes, you also see resistance, as I said, because when the Yogam decides that certain festivity is not going to happen, and the people decide that this has been happening and we will go, yes, they do it, and then they pay a fine. And then you would find that on Sundays being Sabbath, when Bishop Mar Kurilos came, he decided that no more work on Sundays, but people initially didn't listen. I was able to count around 14 of them who worked on Sundays and paid a fine for a single Sunday. Yeah, can we go further on? Yeah, I was talking about the scribes. So signatures tell us a lot of things. If it's just a cross, an identification person. But sometimes you'll find if it's a Varki, the Va will be there and the cross will be there. You'll have a full signature there also. So these are important. Now have the next one. Again, astrological practices. Palpustagam is something that we Syrians had. So if you're going somewhere and you had to know whether the omen was good, you would go to the priest and he would look up the Palpustagam and tell you. And this is a snap of the Palpustagam from the Kandanada Karotuvital family. Yeah, can I have it? But then in Kurpumbadi, I see a lot of olas which talk about paying fines for doing black magic. So these are the details. I'm sure I don't need to go into it. But these are not the only things. You have murals inside the altar. This is the mural inside the altar of the Cheriyapalli at Kodamangalam. We have many such things that have not been, if you look from outside the altar, the part that is visible may be painted. But inside, where it's not visible from the public, the older ones will remain. But of course, it does suffer through the ages. You can see the modern electrical wiring going through it. Yeah, can I have? And this is the icon of St. George that we found at the Kundukuradi Church, which is, again, if you look into the arts or architectural part, this is very important. We do not talk about the architecture. Even Kerala architecture that we talk about, where are the roots? Where do we actually put it through? That is very important. And when you look at these icons, you would see that they're not figures. It's attached on a wooden board. It's just a plate. And even today, if you have a hand pain or an eye pain, we have a habit of giving a votive eye in silver and putting it there. So these practices are in number. So if you look at the sources that we have, as I said, the carriers are palm leaf manuscript, they're ola, or they're on paper, they are text, they're on tables, they're on wood, the whole place. And where are all these? Why am I talking about it so much? They're just not local. as I said, the church and the market had many more connections, as you can say with the temple and the market, because many a times the Christians were brought in by the rulers to settle there so that they would be able to enjoy the largesse that would come in from the trade, so to speak. So, and if you look at it, these church festivals, you would find who are they? They have land, so who are they employing? They're employing the lower caste people. They're employing everyone. You have something called Satyam Jalala, where you have a Christian and a non-Christian coming in front of the church and pledging that, you know, what I'm saying is true. And I have a case in Kuruppambadi when it is overseen by the Parur Kacheri. So this is I mean, as I said, you know, yesterday when I sat with it, what do I start, where do I start? I was like a person who saw the woods and I didn't know which bird or a tree I wanted to spotlight myself upon. And I'm sure you've understood why in this small presentation of mine. Thank you so much. I would like to thank Mohammed and the iShore for asking me here to give this presentation so that I would be able, it made me showcase what we did in that small span of time. And to the students here, there are a lot of materials out there for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. May I now request Dr. Carolyn Stolte to speak. I hope you want to go first? Okay, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, so this is Leonard Bus. I hope that, you know, from Temple and Church, Leonard will take us to a new register. Yes.
I feel more free if I can hold the mic in my hand. Okay, I apologize. I have a very boring shirt compared to Jos Gomans, but next time, if I'm here again, I will make sure that it will be full of temples and courts and boats and markets and whatnot. Okay, what I will do is talk about dialogues in Dutch and Indian sources, because that's the name, that's the theme of this whole get-together. Basically, I will do two things. I will very briefly talk about Dutch sources on Kerala. I've spoken about that in the morning, but for those who were not there, I will very, very briefly explain how much there is and what kind of information is there. And then in the second part, I will talk about really what happens if you bring Dutch sources and Indian sources together, if you confront them. What problems may you encounter and how can we solve them? And I probably only have time for one example, but let's see, there might be two examples. Okay, next slide please. So these Dutch records, the records of the Dutch East India Company, they deal with the whole of Asia, of course, and even Southern Africa. But those that are relevant for Kerala are kept at two places. At the top left, you see the Dutch records, as they are called, in the Tamil Nadu archives. And then there's also a large collection of Dutch records relevant for Kerala in the National Archives of the Netherlands. So it gives you some idea what it looks like. And it's quite a lot. It's more than 100 meters of records. If you put them like in a library in a row, more than 100 meters. Actually, we should count more precisely. But something like that. All dealing with Kerala in the 17th and 18th century. Can you show me the next slide? This is a volume of records found in the National Archives of the Netherlands. You can already see on the cover it says Malabar, received from Malabar in 1736. It's the 4th volume of that year. So for that year you have 4 volumes and they are really thick, like this thick, for 1 year. And then you have that for a period of about 150 years. So you have something like 500 to 600 volumes about Malabar this thick. So it gives you an idea of the amount of information. Next slide, please. Okay, what is in this enormous quantity of records on Kerala? Well, I always try to categorize it in 2 ways for my students. In the top row, you could say there's of course a lot of information about the Dutch in India. That's logical. This is basically company administration. But there's also a lot of information about the Dutch and India. So what we may call cross-cultural interaction. So there's a lot about this interaction, these contacts. But there's also a lot about what the Dutch say about India. Things they are not directly involved in, but a lot of information about India. Another way you could divide the information, of course this is very simplified, but just to give you an idea, there's obviously economic information, as symbolized by the coin. But there's also a lot of political information. Well, you also already made that clear, of course, there was a lot of political interaction. So there you see the gun, again with the VOC logo. I chose a gun because, of course, there was often violence involved. And then the third one is an Indian kalamkari showing someone from the Coromandel Coast who puts a VOC coin in a jar. So this is sort of symbolic for the cultural information, but of course in the end it was always connected to this economic aspect. Next slide, please. Okay, just to give you very brief idea again. Okay, what can you find in these records? Just an example. What you see here are two images of a report of a VOC, a Dutch embassy, to the courts of Travancore and Koilom in 1665. And these two examples both concern the interaction of the Dutch with royalty. So the top example says that the Dutch ambassador in that year was received by the second prince of Travancore, and that he was welcomed in a very nice way, and that actually the prince offered him a handshake, which I think is quite unique, interesting information, because I always learned that the king's body is sacred and not to be touched. But apparently, if we can believe this story, they were just shaking hands. The bottom passage is also quite interesting, because it's about a visit to the queen of Koilom. So this Dutch ambassador arrives at the court, at the palace of the Queen of Koilom, and she is offering the Dutch ambassador food. She's giving him a dish, and it's specified that actually the Nambudri Brahmins are actually serving the food to the Dutchman. I think that's also really interesting. And then he is also saying that this is an incredible honor, and that no other European visitor ever received this honor. I don't know if it's true or he's boasting, but a very interesting passage, I would say. Okay, this was the first part of my presentation, just to give you some idea what kind of records are we talking about. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Now, what happens if we combine this kind of information in the Dutch sources on local events, local people, with Indian sources? Well, unfortunately, my examples will not concern Kerala, because I spent the past decades working on the successor states of Vijayanagara, these Nayaka states, and I only recently started with Kerala, so I don't have so many nice examples yet. So if you can forgive me, I will talk on the Nayaka states, but I think the same could be done in all likelihood with Kerala. So I work on these successor states. Here you see some of them, the Nayakas of Ikeri, the Nayakas of Madurai. You're probably quite familiar with them. And basically my research concerns what I call court politics. And what I try to do is combine Indian sources, in my case, so I'm not talking about Kerala, these are royal chronicles, political treatises, paintings, those kind of materials, combining it with the VOC records. Can you show the next slide? Yeah, so this is just to give you an example. On the left you see a Telugu inscription issued by Vijayaranga Chokanatha Nayaka of Madurai from 1710. It's an Indian source, obviously. And on the right side you see a diary of a visit by the same king of Madurai to the VOC in the port of Tuticorin in 1708. So it's more or less the same time, the same person, but two very different sources. Now, of course, both sources have a lot of problems. Sources have always problems, in this case as well. And again, I must stress, I'm not talking about Kerala sources, but these kind of sources Often they present a very idealized picture. These sources were often produced under royal patronage. They are often undated. So it tells you a lot about self-perception, self-fashioning. Whereas the Dutch sources are maybe more precise, maybe more factual, but then you have the problem, of course, of Eurocentrism, Orientalism. Maybe the Dutch actually didn't understand what was going on, or were just making up stories to please their superiors. So there you have also a lot of problems. That's actually the very reason why I try to combine both, and see if somehow I can then circumvent these problems, and at least be able to provide more nuance about a certain event. So I will present at least one example, and it deals with royal successions, so successions to the throne. Next slide, please. No, the previous one. Yeah. Okay. So this is a succession that took place in Ikeri in 1661, in September 1661, and what happened was that Venkatapanayaka I, who was actually the brother of an earlier ruler, Shivapanayak, he was succeeded by his nephew, Bhadrapanayaka, who was Shivapanayaka's son. So if that's confusing, basically you just have to remember that the uncle was succeeded by the nephew. And then we have a number of Indian sources. They are all chronicles. One of them is the Keladi Arasara from Shavali. It means something like the family history of the royal family of Keladi, which is another name for Ikeri. It's in Canada. I can't read Canada, but fortunately the British collected this document and translated it in the year 1800, more or less. And this is what the chronicle says, what the Indian source says about this succession to the throne. And it's in sort of archaic English, but it says, Venkatapatanayak, the brother of Shivapanayak, so that's the uncle, was acknowledged at the Auramana palace of Bidunur, which is Beit Nur, the capital of Ikeri, and assumed the government of the kingdom. So this is actually describing how the uncle became king. He, the uncle, maintained his nephew, Bhadrapanayaka, in an honorable manner, becoming his rank. He, that is still the uncle, governed his kingdom without dread of the wicked from, and then there's a very complicated local dating, but basically it means 6060 to 6061. So he reigned for about a year. And then it says, Bhadrapanayaka, so that's the nephew, the eldest son of Shivapanayak, was then acknowledged in the kingdom. He governed mildly and reputably. So basically we have a story of a very peaceful succession, a very harmonious transition from one king to another. This is also the story you find in several other chronicles, and so this is also the story you find in the modern historiography, in books like The Nayakas of Ikeri, History of Keladi, those kind of publications. This is what you read. Well, the Dutch had also to say something about this. Next slide. This is part of a Dutch letter about the same succession, and it's only one of the documents. Well, you can already see there was apparently a bit more to say than only this harmonious transition. It's a letter from May 1662, so it's only about 7 or 8 months later than the actual event. And they present a rather different picture of this event. So I translated a small part for you, and let's read it. Next slide, please. So they are writing, so this is, let's say, a quite lowly placed VOC servant to his superior. What he's writing is, we, so that's the Dutch, were informed how Ventapanayak, the uncle, was killed by the general named Shivalingya with the help of Bhadrapanayaka, that's the nephew, the eldest son of the deceased Shivapanayak. So they knew actually quite well how the family relations were, and how mentioned prince, the nephew, was raised to the throne in his father's place. This happened because that Ventapanayak, so that's the uncle, loved the single-headed reign too much. So he was some kind of dictator, apparently, which not only made him forget to pay appropriate respect to the said prince, and general, but moreover, he secretly decided to take Shivalingya's life and Badapanayaka's side. So actually this says that the uncle was plotting to kill his general and to blind his nephew, so to render him unable to ascend the throne. And then the text continues, but they, so that's the general and the nephew, observing matters were not right, wangled for so long that they found out about the secret. And seeing the approaching danger that threatened them, they, again the nephew and the general, resolved to make a virtue out of necessity, and let Ventapanayak, the uncle, fall into the trap that was set for them. Next slide, please. On September 8th last, so that was in 1661, the aforesaid prince and general, both provided with a good saber, without any retinue but 2 or 3 trusted guards, moved in the morning at dawn to the palace of Ventapanayak, the uncle, who they caught in his bedroom as he was waking up, accompanied by the chief counselor and chamberlain. Grasping the betrayal, the king, that's still the uncle, called for his handgun, but jumping on him, Shivalingya, the general, dealt Ventapanayak a blow on the head so heavy that he fell on the ground and vomited his soul right away. That is nice old Dutch for he died. The counselor and chamberlain who tried to protect the king were also hacked down. Seeing their intention accomplished as desired, they, so that's the nephew and the general, they hastily commanded that the gates of the palace be closed and reinforced with trusted guards until order had been restored. And it goes on and on and on, but the outcome of the story is that the nephew then became the next king. So, now what was I to do when I read this? And I was familiar with the other version. That was really difficult. I have 2 totally opposed sources. And which one I should trust? The Dutch one or the Indian one? Well, of course, that's really difficult to say. But the good thing was, it forced me to be really critical of both sources. Because apparently, yeah, at least one of them is not correct, or maybe both of them are not correct. So I was really forced to think more. So I was thinking, okay, in what context was this produced, for whom, when, who would read this text? And I realized the chronicle was written under the descendants of that nephew, because he came on the throne, he stayed on the throne, and his descendants were the rulers of Ikeri from then on, and at the end of the 18th century that chronicle was produced. So I thought, okay, I'm not going to trust the chronicle, because they only want to justify their place on the throne, and yeah, maybe I better believe the Dutch source. But of course there are also problems with the Dutch source, because we have all these details what happened that morning in the room, but the Dutch were not there in that room to witness it. So it's also not very reliable. So what to do? And then I thought, okay, this information, where does it come from? Well, the problem is the Dutch rarely say where they get information from. They just write it down. If you're lucky, they say rumors have it, etc., etc. So we don't know, but we may assume from other records that this is just what they heard. This was recorded in a small port, Vengurla is just north of Goa. Yeah, they were friends with the local people. They had contacts with local traders. There was, of course, rumors in the market. So my assumption is that these are actually local rumors that were recorded by the Dutch. So in a way, it's a local source. It's the local voice. As Western historians, we always lose for the local voice, because then we have the idea we are closer to what was going on. So in a way, there are several layers in this Dutch source, right? It's recorded by the Dutch. We don't know how well they understood it, but at the background there is these Indian rumors, and we don't know how reliable they are. So in the end, what I only could do is conclude that probably this was not a very peaceful transition. I think we can assume that, because otherwise we would not have had this story. So I think that what the Chronicle says is probably not true. But of course it is very interesting in itself that they portray a different image of what happened. Okay, I'm sure I already have used all my 20 minutes, so I think this example is enough. What I just wanted to show is, if you work on certain topics, of course it cannot be done for everything, but if you work on certain topics, for instance, political developments, it can really be very fruitful to bring together the Indian sources and the Dutch sources. Because you have two perspectives, it really forces you to look at it from two sides. And we can say that 1 + 1 is not 2, but 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonard, for that intervention. How nicely Dutch has described a murder. May I invite Dr. Carolyn Slote to make her intervention now, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I interpreted the idea of a dialogue between Dutch and Carolyn sources slightly differently. So today, all throughout the day, we've been talking about the various ways in which we as historians can productively use these types of dialogues today in the 21st century. I'm going to backtrack a little bit to not the 2020s, but the 1920s, and talk about someone who actually already did that, and did exactly that. And that was K.M. Panikkar, the historian from Kerala, who actually spent some time in the Netherlands bringing these types of sources into dialogue with one another. So what I'm going to argue in 15 minutes is actually that we can talk about the ways in which these different source materials are talking to each other in K.M. Panikkar's work, but that in fact, that act of bringing those sources into dialogue almost obscures the fact that there were multiple dialogues going on at the same time as Panikkar was writing this, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Can we go to the next slide, please? Because we remember K.M. Panikkar by and large as, you know, quite a sort of an elderly statesman, right? Most of the photographs that we have from him are actually from the 1950s, when he was India's ambassador to China, to Egypt, to France, right? Very kind of formal elder statesman. I'm going to talk about the Panikkar of the 1920s, when he himself was in his late 20s and was quite a different actor, both politically and academically. Next slide, please. So the work that is going to take center stage here is his Malabar and the Dutch, which emerged slowly over the course of 1925, 1926. And this work is actually often seen as sort of a twin companion to his Malabar and the Portuguese. They were both published in sort of quick succession and based on a very similar strategy of research. Because Panikkar had neither command of Portuguese nor of Dutch. And in gaining access to those sources, he actually employed quite a profitable strategy. So he went to Lisbon in 1925 and engaged the help of students from Goa who could read the Portuguese materials and in that way kind of make accessible some of the source materials to him. Now, he did similarly in the Netherlands, which was quite a feat because obviously for historical reasons, 1920s Leiden University didn't have a very large population of Indian students. And this, in fact, is where my idea of multiple dialogues is going to come into play. But first, next slide, please. Yeah. On the face of it, Malabar and the Dutch brings multiple sources in conversation, and I should say straight off that these are by no means radical choices, right? I want you to keep in mind that we are talking about the 1920s and not the 2020s. Panikkar was in fact one of the first historians to seriously attempt this. So while spending time in the Netherlands, and I'll talk more about his stay in the Netherlands in a minute, he worked with, among others, Philippus Baldeus' work, which is quite extensive, several of the memorandums, right, for succeeding company officials that we've been talking about throughout the day, as well as 18th century accounts, such as the one by von Imhoff. He paired that mostly by doing work in Kerala itself and gaining access to the libraries of, among others, Cochin, with the Patapatu, right, war ballads on which Mahmoud, who's sitting over there, has actually published recently, the Maman Kodaran on the Zamorin's relations with Cochin and the Dutch East India Company. And then as he moves through his story, some frustration is also there. And this frustration is one can glimpse from moments where he says, so far the private records in important families have been treated as something mysterious, and students have no access to them. So all throughout the work, we see that there is the awareness that there's all these other materials that he might have productively used, but didn't succeed in getting access to. So his work, and I think this bears keeping in mind as one kind of thinks about what Malabar and the Dutch accomplished as an historiographical contribution, it's clearly presented as the beginning of something. It's a survey of exploring what is out there, but it is also one with severe limitations. Panikkar doesn't pretend to have command of Dutch. He doesn't pretend to have seen all of the Caroline sources. This is also a work of public history in which he tries to accomplish something. And what he tries to accomplish is in fact not a history of the Dutch in Malabar. If one reads the work, it's in fact a history of the rise and fall of Nayar power, right? And he uses Dutch sources. This is actually something that would be considered quite innovative today. He relegates the Dutch to the sidelines and actually talk about how those sources can open up information on local power dynamics. Could I have the next slide, please? Because in this way, I would actually argue that what we see as these twin works, right, Malabar and the Portuguese and Malabar and the Dutch, are not in fact twin works in that sense, right? They're not two survey works on two separate European actors in Malabar. Malabar and the Portuguese is quite straightforward. Panikkar is, well, he's very explicitly negative about the Portuguese, right? His evaluation of Portuguese presence is on the whole as a violent imperialistic regime. And he's quite mild about the Dutch, and you actually have to kind of hunt for real statements on, kind of his voice as an historian about what he thought about Dutch power. It's not that kind of work. The closer parallel, I would argue personally, is between Malabar and the Dutch and Panikkar's novel Perang Kipatiali, right, Portuguese Soldier, where it is more of a way of using Portuguese presence in Malabar as a backdrop to what is in fact a local story. So, parallels, but not quite. So we have this one dialogue in Malabar and the Dutch between, on the face of it, 17th and 18th century material in both Dutch and Malayalam, and together he combines it into a story of competition between Travancore and Cochin, an evaluation of Nayar power, kind of the long decline of it, and builds it into a local history. But that begs the question still, how did Panikkar in fact make use of these Dutch sources? Could I have the next slide, please? And this has a complicated explanation. Panikkar, in 1926, came to Leiden and flew completely under the radar of the university establishment. Nobody noticed he was there. They could have and they should have. I mean, he was an Oxford-educated historian who had recently resigned his professorship from Aligarh Muslim University, where he had spent several years as a professor, right? So he could have been received in Leiden, but his visit, and I have looked, went by completely unnoticed by all groups but one, which was actually the group that invited him. This was the Perhimpunan Indonesia, so the Indonesian Students Association for Indonesian students in the Netherlands. This is an Indonesian nationalist organization, best seen by actually the second person who's standing from the left, which is Muhammad Hatta, one of the fathers of the Indonesian nation. And they invited Panikkar to come and stay with them. And I mean this in a very literal sense, since you can see the quote by Panikkar on kind of the thoughts he had about South and Southeast Asian connections as he stayed in these students' homes, shared their food, etc. They struck up a very profitable arrangement. Next slide, please. Which is actually the second dialogue I want to talk about. So, how did these Indonesian students even know that Panikkar was there, that Panikkar was in Europe, that Panikkar might be an interesting interlocutor for them? And this has a lot to do with interwar Paris. And this is actually the second set of dialogue that I think is sort of underneath the production of Malabar and the Dutch. So Paris at this time was a hotbed for kind of a lot of different forms of anti-imperialism. There's a lot of great work about this. I won't reiterate it here because it's not really my point. My point is that there existed various Asian studies associations in Paris, primarily at the Sorbonne University, which were comprised of mostly historians and a few legal scholars, jurists, who together used or wanted to use their academic work in service of writing new histories, for a new time, for a new world order, for kind of a new world order that they also, as kind of young up-and-coming scholars and activists, very self-consciously wanted to help bring into being. Now, this dialogue actually occurred between not just Indian and Indonesian students, Vietnamese students, Chinese students, primarily from the Guomindang, but even as far afield as Azerbaijan. So a prominent scholar, Topchubachev, who had a very similar agenda of Asian solidarity, but one that was more kind of Russia-focused and alliances in the Caucasus. So together, these students did something that is quite remarkable and directly formed the occasion and the context in which Malabar and the Dutch could be written. Next slide, please. Somewhat counterintuitive, perhaps. The Bierville Democratic International Congress for Peace in 1926. Now, I'm adding this because I just want you to kind of imagine this moment. Bierville is a tiny, tiny village outside of Paris. And in 1926, 5,000 peace activists descended upon this town in order to kind of see if they could salvage the very fragile peace in 1920s Europe. For obvious reasons, these were predominantly French and German peace activists, very worried about kind of the turn that European politics were taking. So imagine this, there's 5,000 peace activists, all of them white, from Europe, camping out in the fields just outside Paris, talking about peace. Next slide, please. And then these 5 guys, so this is K.M. Panikkar, Mohammed Hatta, Duong Phan Giao for Vietnam, Chung Giao for China from the Kuomintang, and this Azerbaijani man, Topchubachev, who with the 5 of them styled themselves as the Asian delegation at this conference, and go on the dice and basically say, you are wrong. All of you are wrong. The biggest threat to world peace right now isn't what is happening in Europe. It is, in fact, what is happening in Asia. And without full and complete decolonization, there can never be world peace. So fix that first. So this is quite a daring thing to do at this time in this context, and it's quite a big moment. And yet it still kind of begs the question, why tie these 2 stories together, right? So on the one hand, we have a dialogue here between these students from disparate spaces who find and produce a anti-colonial solidarity together. And this produces also something else. If you look at later pamphlets authored by these people, all of whom became important nationalists in their own right. We see a pamphlet like Indonesië Vrij, Free Indonesia by Mohammed Hatta, which actually contains a lot of the ideas that Panikkar wrote for this Peace Congress in this pamphlet called Asia and Peace, right, which he brought before the audience in Bierville. So, on the wings of this type of sort of anti-colonial fervor, the Indonesian students invite Panikkar to join them in Leiden. And they invite him to join them in Leiden as sort of part of a twofold arrangement. Panikkar wanted to write Malabar in the Dutch, right? He had already completed Malabar in the Portuguese in manuscript, and he wanted to write a similar work for the Netherlands. And they got to talking about this, and the deal was that Panikkar would supply the Indonesian students with on-the-ground information about what was happening in India at the time. So non-cooperation strategies, how to organize a satyagraha, basically what was happening in India in the 1920s, and write these up for their publications, which they then could spread among other Indonesian nationalists. And in turn, the Indonesian students would make the Dutch source materials accessible to Panikkar himself. Right? So Panikkar provided the writing to the Indonesian students provided the writing to K.M. Panikkar. So here we have 2 parallel dialogues happening at the same time. But if we think about kind of the work it produced, it's actually, it becomes a lot less counterintuitive that Malabar and the Dutch should actually be much more of a local history of the rise and fall of local power than Malabar and the Portuguese had been previously. Next slide, please. So, I know that time is short and we've already taken up a lot of your time, but I wanted to add one brief postscript. So Malabar and the Dutch, in its present, right, its present at the time, in the 1920s, was very much a product of the Asian solidarity that these anti-colonial internationalists were themselves producing. Right, so very much in that way also a product of its time. But Panikkar has a second career in the Netherlands, and I just had to kind of mention this, because that same Asian solidarity, that sense of Asian unity stayed with Panikkar throughout his career, and is also just as much reflected actually in his career as a diplomat. However, it is also reflected in the fact that in the 1950s, Panikkar was invited to return to these materials once more in the newly established UNESCO's project on the history of mankind. Right, so for its Asian partial project, right, there was a UNESCO history of Latin America, Africa, Asia, etc. So for the history of Asia, Panikkar returned to the Netherlands a second time in the 1950s, and here we see Panikkar kind of as the elder statesman, together with the Dutch historian Jan Romein, collaborated in this way to produce the history of Asia, where they ended up revisiting a lot of these materials. And why is this relevant? Because this is the time that famous Dutch historian of the Dutch East India Company in Malabar, Mattancherry, actually did her PhD with Jan Romein. So finally, these two pre-war early works on the Dutch in Malabar that were written by Panikkar and Mattancherry respectively in the 1920s and 30s, finally got to meet again in 1950s Amsterdam. So that is the third hidden dialogue that I just wanted to bring in there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. for bringing that fascinating story of Ken Panikkar, who got his Indonesian mediation in their unity of anti-colonialism, perhaps. May I now invite Dr. Binu to make his intervention.
Actually, as you mentioned earlier, I am actually trying to dampen the spirit of yours rather than giving some suggestion about how to use the other documents or other sources to corroborate the Dutch sources available in Kerala. So first of all, I need to tell you that Kerala history is already Brahmin-centric and temple-centric. And I don't think that we should do it again with Dutch sources. But at the same time, you are mentioning there are a lot of possibilities. I know, I am sure that there are a lot of possibilities. For example, you were mentioning about one source where the authority of the Brahmins were challenged in Tiruvalla. But at the same time, I have seen local documents which were also mentioning about the same thing happening in the 16th and 17th centuries. So it is very interesting for me. I was also actually suggesting for the same thing, but it was not very much very well received by some Kerala historians. But still, I think that because you need to look Kerala history from a long-term perspective, where at least from the 8th century AD, where you can see that from the 8th century to that of the 14th century is, for some historians, up to 18th century is regarded as Brahmin-centric, where the Brahminical ideology and temples were were at the center of Kerala cultural and political sphere. But when you read, that's the possibility of reading the Dutch documents, where you can see that, not only Dutch, even Portuguese documents, where you can see that by the 16th century, at least by the 16th century, but if you can make use of, I don't know whether it's possible to make use of these Arabic documents that Muhammad would tell us. But I think that you can actually see that at least from the 14th century onwards, there was a challenge to the Brahminical authority in Kerala. So nobody has ever noted about that or even written about that. So there is a possibility that if you are focusing on the temples, especially in central Kerala, given in Dutch documents, you would be able to get more information about the conflicts going on between the temple authorities and the emerging or the existing political elites in Kerala. So that is a greater possibility. But at the same time, I wonder that you may not be able to get local documents that would corroborate all the information in the Dutch documents. For example, I can see that I was doing about opium trade in Malabar. You can see that at least from the 16th century onwards, opium was one of the most important commodities imported to Kerala by the Portuguese as well as by the Dutch. And you can see that by the beginning of the 18th century, the Dutch realized that opium had a great potential in Kerala because a lot of people were consuming opium. So they started to import opium from different parts to Kerala because it was one of the most important commodities. They believed that had a great demand, and that would invariably make the Dutch settlement in Kerala more profitable. And there are a lot of sources that the consumption of opium was increasing in Kerala. And there are sources that would tell that even the Nayars were using opium to a great extent. But we don't have any local sources. I was going through many of the published temple records. You would get some information about the consumption of arak among the Nayars and among the people, local people, but you won't see anything about opium. So where all this opium were going, and why the local people were concerned about that, why the local people were not recording about that. Even in the 18th century, you can see that Kunjanambiyar was writing about the consumption of liquor or the arak among the Nayar soldiers, how it affected their performance, etc. But they were not. He was not mentioning about opium. So, what I think that not only by corroborating the local sources with the Dutch documents, the Dutch sources can also be used as a what we can say that as a source to fill the vacuum in the history of Kerala. So that is the importance of Dutch documents, I think. There is a possibility that you can make some sort of comparison between Dutch documents and European sources, the indigenous sources. But at the same time, you should be very careful that that's not always possible. Secondly, I think that what Susan was telling was very interesting because you can see when I was going through some documents, church documents in Thrissur, for example, I came across a lot of documents mentioning about the economic importance of churches in central Kerala. Actually, it was in central Kerala, in Thrissur district, that the beginning of banking happened in Kerala. So many of those private banking institutions that emerged in central Kerala were actually started by churches because they would say kuris. Kuris means some, I don't know whether there is some equivalent English word, but it was a primordial or some sort of primitive form of banking happened in Kerala. But I don't know whether, unfortunately, you can see that many of these church documents are being destroyed, even recently, without realizing the importance of many of these documents. So, church documents can be used as an important source, but I don't know how far the church documents were belonging to the 16th and 17th centuries available today. But possibility is there that still we have a lot of documents unearthed by historians. So if it is possible, especially in the case of Central Kerala, that would be a great opportunity for historians to make sort of link between Dutch archival materials and local sources. And also I think that Mahmood has been doing a lot with Arabic documents. That's also a possibility how to do with Arabic documents. So there are a lot of opportunities, but at the same time there are a lot of challenges too. But I also think that there is no need to always make a statement that whether it is right or wrong, or whether the Dutch document is wrong or the indigenous document is right or something like that. But I think that if it is possible, you can make some sort of comparison between the two sources. But at the same time, that would be very challenging. But there are possibilities too. But I hope that somebody would do that, and that would be great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very enlightening proceedings so far. I'm not going to summarize what they have said already because we are already running short of time. But the point by and large made by these individual presentations by these resourceful scholars is what perhaps Joss was actually mentioning in the beginning about intersections, you know, or perhaps transections, you know, a little more blurred idea about the boundary. But then, as Binu was, Dr. Binu was rightly pointing out towards the end, this enterprise of intersection, what should be the focus? Is it our themes which are already being explored, you know, in detail, like temple, mosque, and churches, or we should actually change our optic to, I mean, everyday life, people, agriculture, labor, you know, etc. That's the first set of questions that I would like to, you know, place before the panel. Second issue, which is quite apparently has come out in the presentation of Dr. Carolyn, is the politics of translation, right? So this intonation mediation, of course, in the unity of anti-colonialism, has actually involved translation and how actually we, separate translated documents from the original, right? And also the intellectual collaborations that K.N. Panikkar was actually doing in Leiden in his first visit as well as in his second visit in the 1950s. So how would we locate translations and intellectual collaborations in this so-called enterprise of intersections? Third issue that I found striking is what happens if the sources contradicts? Leonard basically raised that question quite profoundly through that example of Nayakas. Now, the immediate thing would be drawing a binary between the local and the foreign, perhaps. But the other possibility would be perhaps to understand the foreign sources, to look at the local history, which are not otherwise, informed. But I think a much more critical point is how, the local politics is implicated in the documents produced by the, foreign scholars or foreign companies like this. And are they impartial onlookers, or are they part of the larger political landscape, and where are they actually siding to, right? And the last point that I want to flag for discussion is, of course, all of these presentations has actually underlined the need for moving away from an idea of autonomy of sources, right? One idea of source which is actually inherited from the modernist idea of history is according autonomy to every form of sources. And Janadit Guha perhaps exemplified it through his idea of reading against the grain, right? The same set of source can be used for multiple purposes. So an autonomy is assumed there. But my question is, how can we overcome this idea of autonomy through these parallel readings of sources? How can we actually resolve incompleteness in one set of sources by reading them through a combined process, and what are the new kinds of incompleteness that we actually create in its wake, right? So I'll flag these issues in front of the panelists and leave it there for a conversation first between you, and then we'll have some small bit of time for open discussion. Yes. Who goes first? Yeah.
Okay. Is it working? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you so much. I think for these 4 points, and also I've learned a great deal from listening to these wonderful other presentations, and they make me rethink the Cosmos Malabaricus strategy, but still, I still think it's, what I would like to suggest is we have 7 years. We have people that are going to work with this material, and personally, I was very much influenced by the work that was going on the other side of the Ghats, in the world of the Nayakas, where you see when you combine literary sources with, let's say, the traditional company sources, there's a lot that is possible. It has a huge amount of a potential. So I was suggesting that we should look at, these topics, these, let's say, themes where the sources come together. And now it's also clear, I tried the most difficult one, that's the temple. It's very clear, because of course I'm very much aware about what's going on, let's say, in the field of the Syrian church, also the Catholic church, the rivalries that are going on. And actually, it's a much more convenient option because the Dutch were surveying this. So the Dutch have a lot of reports about what's going on there. So in that sense, it would be a very good idea. So keep in mind that in my model, it was not just the temple. It was also the synagogue, it was also the church, and also the mosque. And of course, as a historian of the Islamic world, I'm very much aware of the Islamic network. So what I have in mind and is actually so for me, we have a wonderful ancient history of Kerala. We have a wonderful studies on modern Kerala, but there's clearly a kind of hiatus, a gap in the early modern period. So what is going wrong there? So looking at the ocean, I think, is one solution, because through the backwaters, the oceans are very close to the interior. That's for sure. But for me, I still cannot believe that the massive amount that you talked about, we're still at the very beginning of dealing with that. So my appeal is actually to historians of Kerala, also take that material seriously. And perhaps one way of doing it is actually where you can build a bridge with European materials. So that is what I try to say. So yes, this is about local history. And of course you get a kind of, you still have a fragmented perspective on history because your source is telling different things from my sources. But that's exactly why we are doing this, because life is too complicated for one genre of sources. So I still, really based on what I've seen in Tamil Nadu, and also based on the recent work by Haridas on Calicut, I think it is possible. But we should take seriously the enormous amount of material that is coming out of the Syriac Renaissance, the rethinking of the Jewish community, the Muslims that are looking for a narrative about their identity because of their relationships with across the ocean. So for me, this is a fascinating period where the Dutch are just playing a marginal role, but there's a window. So yeah, so in that sense, I actually agree with your point. So you ask me whether I'm converted. I'm a convert. So in that sense, okay, I'll just move on.
Thank you for flagging those very important points. Yeah, I was always the person for everyday histories because my sources are micro. So yeah, I can see resistance, I can see compliance, I can see disciplining from a higher body, and at times my sources are incomplete. I just get one document and then I have to go back and reconstruct with certain words. For example, translations. It's not very easy for me. If I have to translate Petrodoshan to English, I was just not able to, or Travancore to English. I am not Asher to come up with me granddad. I think we'll have to have Fatima's help. That is where I always think that it's not just the historian who needs to be part of these sources, or somebody who looks at Dutch. This was very well exemplified a month ago when we went to Puducherry. We had Santosh who knew the co-editor, but Kolerite, as you know, is not very easy to read because the word Chinoi. And we were sitting and wondering, what is Chinoi, Chinoi, Chinoi? And then we had somebody who was slightly sound in theology telling us that, you know, this is August 14th. And then if it is August 14th, it could be the Sunoyo festival that you are having, as because Shah is not there in Kolerite. So it is a very, it should be an effort where you have people from different disciplines cutting across. People who know different languages. Syriac is important, Malayalam is important, Kolerite is important. You would need people who look at art, you will need people who look at architecture, you would need the linguist. That is also very important because you are able to, you get language, your manuscripts sometimes talk about liturgy and theology, and then you have to go back and then find out, you know, when did these debates start? If you have to date them, it's not very easy at that point. So if you would have asked me, it's not contradictions that matter, it's the diversities that we should encompass. Yeah, we are not going to have a full story. If the Dutch is going to speak from their point of view. I see you today, I'm going to see, oh, probably, I like your face. Or somebody else is going to say, oh, no, I like the camels in his shirt. I mean, that would be it. But then that is all there. That was all part of it. So, as we historians say, it's not just one eyewitness that we have. We have many eyewitnesses, many windows, many doors through which we should pass through. There would be still areas of darkness, but there will be a lot more light at the end of it all, if you ask me. So that is what is needed. Reading with the grain, yeah, reading against the grain, but all sources are not always authoritative. I mean, why do we write? We write to put something down, so we need to take that into consideration. So if it's a VOC source, VOC has to project it somewhere else. If it's a church source, why is it being said that way? Or, you know, who is it for? And things like that. So it's this whole lot of things. For example, if I see a very elaborate burial in those 3,000 auras that I went, just one. Why did I get that just one? And then probably I have to go into ethnography. So it's a whole lot of work and whole lot of collaborations. More the better, more the merrier.
Thanks. I actually really appreciate the point about, you know, all sources are not authoritative in different ways, right? And bringing up the points about mediation. It matters which sources we use, obviously, but it also matters where we use them, when we use them, and with whom, and in what context. And I think in the case of the story I shared about kind of the history behind the book Malabar and the Dutch, this is particularly true. And if, you know, as for a long time was the case, we don't realize how it was made. It's actually, there are a few striking elements in the book that will otherwise always remain unexplained. So for instance, for a commodity that was really not traded by the Dutch in Malabar very much, opium, I appreciate you for mentioning opium, you know, Malabar and the Dutch keeps talking about opium, right? For different times, Travancore is mentioning that, you know, there was lots of opium in Java being offloaded at cheap prices, kind of flooding the market, and all of the social ills that came with it. And then basically it goes on to say, so Malabar Dutch pulled it there. There's no reason to put that in a survey on the history of the Dutch and Malabar, unless we remember that Travancore is sitting there with Indonesian students who are explaining from their Japanese perspective to him what they are reading in the Dutch sources and how that jives with what they know of their history. Right? And there's really no other reason for these references to opium as a story would even be in there. So again, to that point, sources are not authoritative, but who does the explaining, who does the translating, and who does the mediating is very, very influential on the results it produces.
Yeah, well, several things have been said already. I would briefly like to say three things. Of course, the example I gave in my talk, that was the most spectacular story I could present to you. Of course, for very often these different sources don't contradict each other, as in this example. Very often they are complementary. So they provide additional information about the same topic, or they actually confirm each other. And so very often different sources say the same thing, which is great. So I think that we should keep it in mind that actually sources can really come together and reinforce each other. I also have a slight doubt about these Dutch sources. It's a thought I have been having for some time, because, and this reminds me of long discussions with Jos. So I tend to be quite positive, or maybe I should say positivist, about these Dutch sources. But I sort of could afford to say that as long as I was working on the Nayakas, Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, because the Dutch were quite marginal players on the coast, observing things mostly. They could not influence anything, they didn't have the power, they didn't want to do that. So I always said, yeah, they just need reliable information. So I tend to believe it. You know, I tend to think it is relatively unbiased. So now we're in Kerala, and we have a problem because, okay, on the one hand we have more Dutch sources than ever, which is great, and that was the big message of today for me. On the other hand, the Dutch were much more powerful. That's the other side of this massive amount of sources. But the Dutch had much more influence. They sometimes even dictated at courts who should be the next king. So it's very different from this Ikeri example. So in a way, yeah, my previous very positivist approach to these Dutch sources, it doesn't work anymore maybe. I have to be much more careful, because I think the Dutch were much more involved in this Kerala politics. So we have to be extra careful with what the Dutch write. That's especially a lesson for myself. But I think also for everyone else who wants to use these Dutch sources. And then finally, a very practical thing. Okay, it's clear in this trip that there are not only very many Dutch sources, but also lots of other sources. Can't we somehow sort of compile something of an overview that at least we have some idea? For me, it's one big jungle. Would that somehow be possible? Or does that already exist? I don't know, but it would be great if somehow we can set up a place, a website or something where we have something to put overview. Okay, it's probably a dream, but still I would like to mention it. Huh? Exactly, yeah. So yeah, I hope that might be possible one day. Thank you.
Do I need to talk? But anyway, one thing I found very much interesting about Dutch documents is that, especially regarding Malabar, is that I felt always that the Dutch were very keen to understand the nuances of the developments in Kerala, because there were some sort of third parties who were very much interested in knowing actually what was going on in Kerala. So, because the understanding really the local society was very much important for their survival in Kerala. So they always tried to make a veracity of the statement or information they got from local people or local sources. So because they were very careful about knowing exactly the relationship between various kingdoms, various kings, and by doing so they believed that they can be able to make who is in real charge of that particular kingdom, who is the legal one, who is the illegal one, and by doing so they thought that they would be able to make a real contract, a real connection with that particular kingdom. So I think that that would give a lot more authenticity to the Dutch documents to understand the local society. But at the same time, you can see the local sources were very much, you can see that there were different kingdoms, different principalities, and different lineage segments, and they had their own histories, their own interpretation about what was going on there. So the Dutch documents can be used as a sort of checkmate to understand
the veracity of many of the stories, or produced by many of these lineages and lineage segments in Kerala. So, and also to fill the vacuum in Kerala history. So that itself is very important, I think.
So just one note to this wonderful story that Caroline was telling us, because I think first I thought, what is really Panika's contribution, because what did he really do, how much material did you use, and how good were these translations coming from the Indonesians? But he was actually very right about the rise of the Nayar, because that is something you can do with the Dutch material. Because I had long conversations in the break with Avinash about the rising power of the lands in the 17th, 18th century. So he was actually very right about that. So using Dutch sources in the 1920s. So there's this one skepticism. Okay, so what did he contribute? But at the same time, he had this intuition that was right.
I think we can take one or two quick questions from the audience. To them together, or any of them specifically. It's already late, so audience is much wiser than me. But I hope all of you will agree with the fact that this session has actually revealed how resourceful the early modern period is in terms of the availability of sources. And early modern period in the history of Malabar is one of the relatively darker areas. And one reason why this is remained darker because of this commonsensical idea that there is lack of sources. Right? I think that commonsensical notion needs to be corrected, and that's perhaps the biggest message that is actually going out of this panel. Another thing is that when we actually speak about sources, this deliberation also perhaps underlines the fact that rather than treating sources in a hierarchy, right, the sources needs to be grounded on the same ground, right, rather than treating one set of sources as a primary or prime source and the other one as a supplementary, or the so-called cortex. This needs to be flowed on a same ground. But at the same time, this plethora of sources about the early modern Kerala history also perhaps underlines the need of reading them together as well as reading them against each other, right? And with that note, please give a round of applause to the panelists. I request my colleague, Dr. Abdul Latif, to propose a formal vote of thanks.
വളരെ സന്തോഷം. നന്ദി പറയുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ് ഒരു ആകസ്മികമായ കണ്ടുമുട്ടലിനെ കുറിച്ച് പറയുന്നതായിരിക്കും. 2018 ദാറുസലാമിൽ വെച്ച് പരിചയപ്പെട്ടിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സുഹൃത്തിനെ ഇന്നിവിടെ കാണാൻ സ്വാമി സോളർ. അതിവിടെ പറയാൻ കാര്യം എന്താ വെച്ചാൽ ആ ദാറുസലാമിലെ വൈകുന്നേരത്തെ ചില ചർച്ചകളിലാണ് ഐഷോറിനെ കുറിച്ച് മഹമ്മൂദ് ആദ്യമായിട്ട് പറഞ്ഞത്. ഇതുപോലെ ഇത്തരം കോയിൻസിഡൻസുകളുടെ ഒരു തുടർച്ച ഇനിയും നടക്കുന്നില്ല. ഇന്നിവിടെ നമ്മൾ കണ്ടുമുട്ടിയിട്ടുള്ള എല്ലാവരും, നമ്മുടെ രാവിലത്തെ വർക്ക്ഷോപ്പിൽ പങ്കെടുത്തുള്ള എല്ലാവരും ഇതുപോലെ അക്കാദമികമായ വിവിധ സെഷനുകളിൽ കണ്ടുമുട്ടട്ടെ എന്ന് ആശംസിക്കാം. On behalf of iShore, we would like to thank all speakers, participants and audience members for being here, contributing to the discussion. This has been a very rich and lively day with several discussions on serious engagement with Kerala history. Especially, I would like to thank Professor Dineshan Padakini is not here. Actually, he was on the bay and reached Ernakulam, but unfortunately he wanted to go back due to some personal matters. Professor Jos Gomans coming many times in Aishore's events. He inaugurated our webinar series, and today he inaugurated our website also. Professor Joe Gomans for offering new windows to study Kerala history, and also this morning for interacting with young researchers. Professor Susan Thomas from Leiden University. I'm very happy. I'm also from Leiden University. For demonstrating the rich Syriac and Malayalam materials on the basis of extensive research in the field of several years of now. Dr. Karelin Stolte for opening our eyes to the world of Sardar K. Panikkar, who was contributed to history. Dr. Binu John Mailaparapil for sharing his thoughts on Kannur Arakkal Ali Rajas. And I have a small evidence of opium trade in Kerala, and after this I will discuss with you. Dr. Leonard Bus for talking about the political alliances in early modern Kerala. And I would like to thank people behind the project, C.A. Boiling Vessel and Aazhi Archives, who provide all these facilities, especially Chema, Riaz, C.S. Venkateshwaran, M.H. Ilyas, and all others behind this occasion. ഔപചാരികമായി നന്ദി പറയേണ്ടതില്ലെങ്കിലും പറയേണ്ട ചില ആളുകളുണ്ട്. ഈ ഐഷോറിൻ്റെ സെക്രട്ടറി മഹമ്മൂദ് കുരിയ, ഇന്നത്തെ ഈ ചെയർ റൂം ഡിസ്കസൻ്റുമായിട്ടുള്ള വർഗീസ്, അദ്ദേഹം ഐഷോറിൻ്റെ പ്രസിഡന്റ് കൂടിയാണ്. അതേപോലെ ടീച്ചർ അഭിലാഷ് പടേൽ, ഇവിടെ എല്ലാ സാഹിത്യ മാഷ്, സലാപുരത്തിൽ മീര കണ്ണൻ, മനോവി ദേവദേവൻ, സുധീഷ് കോട്ടയം, രേഖ രാജ് തുടങ്ങിയവർ കൂടി ഒരു ഔപചാരികതയുടെ പേരിൽ നന്ദി പറയുകയാണ്. അതോടൊപ്പം തന്നെ ഈ പരിപാടി കോർഡിനേറ്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള ഞങ്ങളുടെ ഓഫീസ് സെക്രട്ടറി ബിലാൽ സിദ്ദി, ഇവിടെ കൂടിയുള്ള എല്ലാവർക്കും നന്ദി പറയാം. ബിഫോർ ദാറ്റ് ഒരു കാര്യം കൂടി അറിയിക്കാനുണ്ട്. നമ്മുടെ റയത്ത് വാരിയുടെ ഏതാനും കോപ്പികൾ, 20 കോപ്പികൾ ഇവിടെ എത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. ഞങ്ങൾ പിരിയുന്നതിന് മുമ്പ് എല്ലാവരും ആ കോപ്പികൾ ആദ്യമേ വന്ന് കളക്ട് ചെയ്യണമെന്ന് അറിയിക്കുന്നു. താങ്ക് യു.